Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. And by the way, before I get into this morning, I've just got to tell you how much I appreciate all of the private messages I've been getting lately. Messages expressing appreciation for morning musings and how the messages that we have been bringing to you have so dramatically, powerfully, wonderfully, and positively impacted your life, renewed your faith in the Lord, renewed your faith in His Word, made you stronger and more able to stand. I just cannot tell you what it means to me to receive that kind of testimonial. You know, William Bell and I have been receiving an increasing number of that kind of response to our ministries. And we talk about this very, very often. We talk about it privately, of how humbling it is to hear from so many of you who tell us of the wonderful response that you have to the message of fulfillment. And that you're sharing, you're growing, you're loving the Lord more than ever. And for that, I thank you for sharing your testimony with us. All right. Well, yesterday I shared with you that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have all three feast days of Israel's Festal calendar. Now let me ask you a question. I've already posed this question before, but here is Paul, who is a good, faithful Jew. He is trained as a rabbi. He observed the Jewish festivals. He was thoroughly trained in the significance, the importance, the prophetic nature of the feast days. And let's not forget this. In Colossians 2:16, Paul said, "Let no man therefore judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which is a present tense," when he wrote in approximately 61-62 AD, "which are a shadow of the good things that are about to come." Those feast days, and remember, he starts off with new moons. That's Rosh Hashanah. Now, virtually all of the feast days, the festivals were feast days. Virtually all of them were Sabbaths. What did they point to? Oh, by the way, many of you have asked me, "Hey, Don, when's your book on the Sabbath going to be ready in which you talk about the feast days?" Well, good question. I'm very eager to get back to it. I wanted to finish this book, where Jesus' apostles confused. I'm actually working on another book that I want to finish first, and then I promised myself no other books to be written by me. I'm going to focus on the Sabbath book and incorporate these ideas of the feast days into it. Boy, this is just good stuff. Okay, so thank you for asking about that book, but we move on. So I shared with you on Monday that if Paul, good faithful Jew, who preached nothing but the hope of Israel, if Paul, thoroughly conversant with the meaning, the typology, the prophetic nature of the feast days, could still write in Colossians 2:16 that those feast days were still prophetic. They were still types and shadows. That means they were still not, when he wrote, they were still not fulfilled. Now, how could he say that? He could say that because the judgment had not come. He could say that because the atonement was not yet consummated, as we pointed out in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 yesterday. You cannot say that Yom Kippur was consummated at the cross without ripping Yom Kippur completely and totally out of its chronological sequence as the sixth out of the seven feast days. And Paul was still anticipating that. just as he said in Hebrews chapter 9, 12 and following, just as in most translations, just as he said in Hebrews chapter 10, 1 and 2, now the law having a shadow of the good things about to come. And what's he talking about? He's talking about the Day of Atonement. He's talking about Yom Kippur, how Christ had come as a high priest to offer himself. He had entered into the most holy place. He was yet to come again the second time apart from sin for salvation. That's Yom Kippur. And that's as he describes Christ's coming, Christ's sacrifice, Christ's entrance into the most holy place, as he talks about all of that, and he says, for, there's that connective particle that connects that discussion with what he's about to say. For the law having present, active, indicative, or present tense, a shadow of the good things that are about to come. So just like Colossians, Hebrews says that when it was written, the law was still a shadow, still present tense, a shadow of the good things, not that had come, as some translations unfortunately render Hebrews 9:12. No, they had not already come, they had begun, but they weren't consummated. Just as Paul said in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6, I am convinced the one who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of the Lord. Process begun, process to be consummated. Okay? So once again, here's Paul, good faithful Jew, conversant with the feast days, who observed the feast days, saying that when he wrote in the 60s that the law, with its feast days, was still binding, was still a shadow of the good things that were about to come. Now, you see, the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 9, 6 and following, that as long as the law stood imposed, from the Greek word epikaimai, imposed, valid, binding. As long as the law stood valid, there was no forgiveness of sin. And as long as there was no forgiveness of sin, there was no entrance into the most holy place, heaven. Now get this. We are told by many, many, many different people, you know, a Westminster Confession of Faith said all of the Old Testament worthies entered heaven when they died. Well, according to Paul, the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin, Hebrews chapter 10, 2 and following. And Christ died to offer, to provide, and to give the remission of sins that were under the first covenant, Hebrews 9:15. So it wasn't until Christ died, it wasn't until Christ's atonement work was consummated that those worthies back then could receive forgiveness. That's why Christ died, for the remission of those sins. And thus, Hebrews chapter 9 says, as long as the law stood valid, imposed, there was no forgiveness. Now, watch this, all right? In Hebrews, the writer, Hebrews 9:28, is very clearly anticipating the second coming. Virtually everybody agrees with that, right? Second coming of Christ. That's to consummate Yom Kippur. But that's the coming of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 23. Is it not? If it's the same coming, then it would be to consummate Israel's feast days. Now remember, Jesus said, not one jot nor one tittle shall pass from the law, and the law contained the feast days, until it is all fulfilled. So as I pointed out on Monday, if you say that Christ's second coming, if you say that the judgment, if you say that the resurrection has not yet occurred, then you are of necessity saying that Israel's last 3 feast days are not fulfilled. And if Israel's last 3 feast days are not fulfilled, then the totality of the law of Moses remains valid and binding. Now I want to show you how this agrees perfectly with 1 Corinthians 15 and where Paul places the fulfillment of the resurrection, Sukkot, the last 3 of Israel's feast days. Paul anticipated the coming of Christ, right? Yom Kippur. Paul anticipated the resurrection, right? That's Sukkot. And when would that resurrection be? It would be when the sting of death, which is sin, and the strength of sin, which is the law, was removed. Now, I want to go back to verse 54 and notice how Paul says, for when the corruptible puts on incorruptibility, then shall be brought to pass. In other words, that's when Isaiah 25 and 8, Hosea 13, that's when those prophecies would be fulfilled. Brought to pass is from the Greek word genetai, brought to being, brought into reality. Okay, so the resurrection is the time when all prophecy is fulfilled. The resurrection is when the law that was the strength of sin would be removed. Oh, what is the law that is the strength of sin? You know, I've had in formal public debate, I have had people say, well, you know, the gospel of Christ is the strength of sin. Really? The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made us free from the law of sin and death, Romans 8. And yet we're told by some, no, the gospel doesn't truly set us free from the law of sin and death. It enforces it. It's the strength of sin. Oh, what a horrid doctrine. But do you get the point? The law would pass when every jot and every tittle was fulfilled. The resurrection is when the resurrection would be fulfilled at the end of the age and at the coming of the Lord in fulfillment of Yom Kippur. And that would be at the end of the law, the strength of sin. In other words, put this another way, very, very quickly, I'm out of time. The resurrection is when every jot and every tittle of the law would be fulfilled. And when every jot and every tittle of the law was fulfilled, the law, the strength of sin, would be removed, giving way to the everlasting, unending, new covenant of life and righteousness in Christ. Oh, what a beautiful picture. And I'm out of time. Okay, listen, do not forget, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend is coming up July 9th through the 11th. Alan Morton, my fantastic webmaster, has got everything all organized. There is a link on BibleProphecy.com, on DonKPreston.com. On July the 9th, you'll be able to click the link. You will be able to watch the lectures. Almost like you're here, all right? Don't fail to take advantage of this. By the way, there'll be chat rooms. You'll be able to express your thoughts, your comments, as long as they're respectful, by the way, about the lectures. So be sure to tune in. Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, July 9th through the 11th, 2020. All right, folks, I will see you on the flip side.